The day Wesley Rourke rode into Dusthaven, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1883, every soul on the main street found a reason to step back inside. Because a man with that particular lean to his jaw and that particular darkness behind his eyes did not come to a town like theirs without dragging something wicked along behind him. He pulled his roan horse to a stop in front of the Dusthaven General Store, swung down from the saddle with the easy grace of a man who had spent more years on horseback than off, and stood there for a moment in the bright morning sun, taking stock of the place the way a gambler takes stock of a new table. The town was modest, the kind that balanced itself on the knife edge between surviving and disappearing, with a main street of sun-bleached storefronts, a livery at the far end, a church with a tilting steeple, and a saloon that appeared to be doing considerably better business than the church. Dusthaven sat in a wide, flat valley where the Rio Puico ran shallow in summer, and the red mesas stood in the distance like old men leaning on their elbows, watching everything without comment. Wesley had been 3 weeks riding down from Colorado, and he carried with him the particular smell of trail dust and distance that made respectable townspeople nervous. What made them more nervous was his reputation, which had preceded him the way a cold wind precedes a storm. He was 31 years old, and already he had 3 things working permanently against him in any decent society. The first was a prison record. He had served 2 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe for a charge of armed robbery, a charge that contained within it a great deal of complicated truth and a great deal more complicated injustice. But the law did not concern itself with complexity, and the brand of convict had been pressed firmly onto his name. The second was his name itself, because the Rourke family of Colorado had a particular reputation for trouble, and his older brother, Dalton Rourke, was a man actively wanted by 3 territories for crimes that made armed robbery look like a mild social infraction. People heard the name Rourke and they thought of Dalton, and then they thought of the worst things they had heard about Dalton, and then they looked at Wesley and decided not to take the risk of distinguishing one brother from the other. The third was his face, which, through no fault of his own, was the kind of face that had absorbed considerable violence over the years. A nose broken twice, a scar running along the left side of his jaw from a knife fight in Albuquerque that he had not started but had emphatically finished, and eyes the color of Winter Creek water, pale and cold at first glance, though anyone who looked long enough might have found something else entirely living in their depths. 3 strikes. In a place like Dusthaven, 3 strikes was more than enough to get a man turned away from every door before he had a chance to knock. He had come to Dusthaven because he had heard there was work to be had at the Harlow Ranch, and because he had heard that Dusthaven's sheriff, a man named Holt Grady, was not the kind of lawman who went looking for reasons to run a man out of town if that man kept his nose clean and his hands busy. Wesley needed work. He needed a clean start. He needed a place where he could put his back against something solid and face whatever came without the constant feeling of the world tilting beneath him. He tied his horse to the post and walked into the general store to buy tobacco and ask directions to the Harlow Ranch. That was when he first saw Fannie Finley. She was standing behind the long wooden counter, and she had both hands pressed flat on its surface, and was reading a letter with such absolute concentration that she did not look up when the bell above the door announced his arrival. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up with the kind of practicality that suggested she did not have the time or inclination for fuss, and her eyes, when she finally lifted them from the letter, were a remarkable shade of brown, the color of dark honey held up against the light, warm and clear and sharp as anything he had ever looked into. She was 24 years old, though he did not know that yet. She wore a plain blue dress with a white collar, and there was ink on her right index finger, and she had a small crease between her brows that suggested she spent a good deal of time thinking seriously about things. She looked at him with those honey-dark eyes, took him in from hat to boots the way a sensible woman takes in a stranger, and said, "Can I help you?" Her voice was steady. Not cold, not warm yet, just steady, and that steadiness struck him as remarkable because most people, upon seeing him for the first time, found some reason to be either wary or unkind, and she was neither. She was simply present, looking at him as though he were a person. "Tobacco," he said, "and directions if you have them to spare." "Directions cost nothing," she said, and moved to the tobacco shelf. "Where are you trying to get to?" "Harlow Ranch. I heard they were hiring." She set a small packet of tobacco on the counter and looked at him again, this time with something that might have been assessment. "Clifford Harlow is particular about who he takes on," she said. "Most men are when it comes to ranch hands. Some more than others." She named the price for the tobacco. He paid it without argument. "You ride north out of town, follow the creek for about 2 miles, and when you see the cottonwood stand with the big split trunk, you turn east. The ranch gate is another mile past that." "Obliged," he said. He was halfway to the door when she said, not unkindly but with a directness that pulled him up short, "I should tell you that Clifford Harlow will have heard about you before you get there. News travels fast in a valley this size." He turned around and looked at her. She had folded the letter and set it on the shelf behind her and was watching him with an expression that was impossible to read precisely, but which contained no malice. "You know who I am," he said. It was not a question. "I know your name. My brother-in-law runs the telegraph office. Word came through from Albuquerque yesterday that Wesley Rourke was moving through the territory." She paused. "I thought you should know, so you are not walking in blind." He stood there for a moment, genuinely surprised. In his experience, people who had information that could harm him tended to use it as a weapon or a reason to show him the door. She had just handed it to him freely, as though she thought he deserved to know the truth of his own situation. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that went deeper than the 2 words covered. "Good luck, Mr. Rourke," she said, and turned back to whatever work she had been doing. He rode north out of town, with the warm New Mexico morning pressing down on his shoulders, and the strangest feeling that something had just shifted in the weather of his life, though he could not have said precisely what. Clifford Harlow was a broad-shouldered man of 50 with a white mustache, and the particular squint of someone who had spent decades reading the horizon for weather and trouble. He received Wesley in the yard of his ranch house, did not offer his hand, and looked at him the way a man looks at livestock he is considering but not yet committed to purchasing. "I know your record," Harlow said. "I expect you do," Wesley said. "I know your brother's record better." "I'm not my brother." Harlow's eyes moved over him slowly. "That is a thing a man can say. Proving it is a different enterprise entirely." "I work hard and I stay honest," Wesley said. "I will not pretend I have a spotless history, because you clearly know I do not, but I am asking for a chance to earn my keep, not a pardon." The silence between them stretched long enough that a mockingbird in the nearby mesquite went through 2 full cycles of imitation before Harlow spoke again. "I need someone who can break horses. My regular man cracked 2 ribs last month and will not be useful for the rest of spring. I can break horses. If you steal from me, I will not go to the sheriff. I will handle it myself. That is the arrangement. I would not steal from you." Another long silence. "You start tomorrow. Bunkhouse is behind the barn. Wages $25 a month and meals." Wesley nodded. "Fair." He settled into the work of the Harlow Ranch with the quiet determination of a man who understood that he was being watched from multiple angles and that every choice he made was being weighed against the reputation he was trying to outlive. He rose before the other hands, worked later than was required, and made himself agreeable without being ingratiating. The other ranch hands were cautious with him at first, 3 of them. A steady older man named Clem, who had worked for Harlow for 8 years and spoke sparingly, but without hostility. A young man named Denny, who was 19 and eager, and who had clearly never heard of the Rourkes, and thus treated Wesley with an open friendliness that felt like sunshine on cold skin. And a taciturn Mexican man named Esteban, who watched Wesley for about a week before deciding something and thereafter treating him as an equal. Which Wesley later learned was how Esteban treated all men he had decided were not fools. He went back to the general store on a Saturday, 10 days after his arrival, to buy a new pair of work gloves because the horses had destroyed the ones he owned. Fannie Finley was behind the counter again. She looked up when he came in, and something in her expression shifted to recognition without any of the wariness he had grown so accustomed to reading in people's faces. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I heard Clifford Harlow took you on." "He did," Wesley said. "Gloves." He held up his destroyed pair as evidence. She came around the counter to a shelf along the south wall and began examining gloves, holding them up and checking the stitching with the efficient focus of someone who took the quality of merchandise personally. He stood nearby, and in the narrow aisle there was perhaps 2 feet between them, close enough that he could see the concentration in her face and the small constellation of freckles across the bridge of her nose. "These are the best I stock," she said, handing him a pair. "The stitching will hold up to rough work. He tried them on, they fit, he said so." She returned to the counter and he followed, and as she wrapped the gloves in paper he found himself asking something that surprised him as it came out of his mouth. "Do you own this store yourself?" She looked up. "I do. My father passed it on to me 2 years ago. He went to live with my sister in Tucson when his health began failing." She said it simply, not asking for sympathy. "I have run it since." "That is considerable," he said. "It is manageable," she said, with a small lift at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the promise of one. He paid for the gloves and went back to the ranch, but he thought about that almost smile on the ride north more than he had any sensible reason to. He came back to the store the following Saturday. He told himself he needed salt. He needed lamp oil. He needed thread because his shirt had a tear in it. These were all true, but they were not the primary reason he was there. She appeared to be in a dispute of some kind when he arrived. The other party was a man named Gerald Tupp, who was broad and florid, and who had apparently decided that the price Fannie had quoted him for a barrel of flour was an act of personal aggression. Tupp was the kind of man who believed that the louder he spoke and the more space he took up, the more correct he automatically became. He was leaning on the counter and speaking to Fannie in a tone that was not quite threatening, but was certainly designed to make her feel small. "Every other merchant in this territory gives a discount to regular customers," Tupp was saying, "and I spend more money in this store than any other 3 men combined, so I expect you to act accordingly." Fannie's expression was composed, but her eyes were very bright and very steady. "Mr. Tupp, I have given you the same price I give everyone, which is a fair price. If you have found a lower price elsewhere, you are of course welcome to take your business there." "That is a fine way to talk to a loyal customer," Tupp said, his face reddening. Wesley had stopped just inside the door. Tupp glanced at him, clearly irritated by the interruption to his performance. "Need something," Tupp said with the confidence of a man who believed his irritation was a natural force that other people should accommodate. "Salt," Wesley said. "But I can wait." "He can wait," Tupp repeated, turning back to Fannie. "So, the price." Fannie looked past Tupp's shoulder to Wesley briefly and then back to Tupp. "The price is what it is, Mr. Tupp. Would you like the flour or not?" Tupp's jaw worked. He looked at Wesley again, perhaps calculating the odds of escalating his argument further with a stranger in the room who had the kind of face that suggested he had been on the receiving end of violence often enough to be no longer particularly intimidated by the prospect. Whatever Tupp calculated, he arrived at the correct answer. "Fine," he said, and tossed his coins on the counter with unnecessary force and took his flour and left. The bell above the door rattled in his wake. Fannie looked at the coins on the counter, then at Wesley, and the almost smile from the previous Saturday appeared again, this time in slightly fuller form. "He does that every month," she said. "And every month you hold the line," Wesley said. "Every month," she confirmed. He bought his salt and his lamp oil and his thread, and they talked for longer than was strictly necessary about the thread, because she had several different weights and colors and seemed genuinely invested in helping him choose the right one for the fabric of his shirt. He stayed in that store for the better part of an hour, and when he left he walked back to where his horse was tied and stood there for a moment in the afternoon sun, aware of something warm happening in his chest that he did not quite know what to do with. He had not been a man who expected good things to come looking for him. He had spent so long braced against the bad that he was not practiced in receiving anything else. The weeks settled into a rhythm. He worked hard at the Harlow ranch, and Harlow watched him with decreasing suspicion, and Clem told him one evening over coffee that the old man had said Wesley was the best horsebreaker he had had on the property in a decade, which was high praise from a man who offered it to no one directly. The horses came to recognize him. He had a particular patience with animals that was the same quality he brought to difficult people, a willingness to wait without pressure, to let trust develop at its own natural speed rather than forcing it. He went to the general store every Saturday. He began to admit to himself, somewhere around the 4th or 5th Saturday, that he went specifically to see Fannie Finley, and that the rest of the shopping was incidental. He also began to notice things about her that a man notices when he is paying close attention. She kept a small vase of wildflowers on the end of the counter, changed every Monday. She had a habit of tapping her pen against her lower lip when she was thinking something through. She was generous in quiet ways, letting the widow Calhorn have credit far beyond what was strictly wise for business, stocking a particular kind of peppermint candy that the schoolteacher's youngest children loved, keeping a water bowl outside for working dogs. She was serious but not stern, direct but not unkind, and she had the particular quality of a person who had learned to depend on themselves without becoming hard. He learned over those Saturdays that her mother had died when she was 12, that she had helped her father run the store from the time she was old enough to make change, that she had been briefly, unhappily engaged to a man named Patrick Greer 3 years ago, who had turned out to have a wife already in Kansas, a fact he had neglected to mention until the truth arrived via the sheriff's office in the form of a warrant, that she loved books and had a small collection of them in the back room of the store, behind the counter, and that she read whenever the store was slow, which in Dusthaven was not as often as she would have liked. She learned things about him, too, because he did not hide them, because he had decided in some wordless way that if something was going to develop between them, it was going to be built on the actual truth of who he was rather than a constructed version he had polished up to be more presentable. He told her about the prison, about what had actually happened, which was that he had been coerced by his brother Dalton into participating in what Dalton had told him was a card game, but had turned out to be a scheme involving the robbery of a ranch payroll, and that Wesley had walked into the situation blind and had tried to stop it and had failed, and had ended up holding a gun he had not fired and facing charges he could not fully disprove, because the witnesses had all been Dalton's men and Dalton had disappeared and left Wesley to take the consequence. He told her this one Saturday in October with the smell of autumn coming through the open store window and the aspen trees on the mesa going gold in the distance. He told it simply and without excuse and watched her face while he spoke. When he finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Your brother left you there." "He did. And you served 2 years for something that was principally his doing." "Something like that. Though I should have known better. I should have asked more questions." She looked at him steadily. "That is a different kind of wrong than what you were charged with. The law did not make that distinction." "No," she said, "the law often does not." There was something in her voice when she said it, a tiredness, an acknowledgement of how often the machinery of justice ground in directions that had nothing to do with justice. She had seen that happen in Dusthaven too, she told him. The Apache families who had been pushed off the land they had worked for generations with nothing but a government notice and a soldier's rifle for explanation. The Mexican landowners whose grants had been disputed by Anglo settlers with lawyers and political connections. The poor men who went to prison while wealthy men paid their way out of the same charges. She was not naive about any of it. He liked that about her. He liked it deeply. She could see the unfairness of the world without either despairing of it or pretending it did not exist. "What are you going to do about your brother?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "If he comes near me, I will tell him to move on. I want nothing to do with Dalton or his business. And if he does not come near you, then I will get on with my life," he said, "which is what I am trying to do." She held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them in that look, something that had been quietly building through all those Saturdays and was now making itself unmistakably known. "Wesley," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice did something considerable to his composure. "Yes," he said. "The town talks about you," she said. "You know that, I know. They say the 3 strikes against you make you a man no decent woman should encourage." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am not counting strikes." "What are you counting?" he asked, and his voice came out quieter than he had intended, rough at the edges. "Something else entirely," she said, and the almost smile had become a real one now, full and warm and aimed directly at him, and he felt it like sunlight breaking through a month of solid overcast. He asked her if she would take a walk with him that Sunday afternoon if the weather held. She said she would. It held. They walked along the creek that ran south of town, where the cottonwoods were losing their leaves, and the water ran quick and cold over smooth stones, and they talked about everything and nothing with the ease of 2 people who have already done the difficult part, the part where you decide whether the other person is worth trusting with the truth of yourself, and have already decided yes. He did not try to kiss her that Sunday. He held his instincts on a careful rein, because he understood that she had been burned before by a man who had moved too fast and too carelessly, and he wanted her to be entirely certain of him before anything moved forward. He walked her back to the store at dusk and tipped his hat and said he had very much enjoyed her company, and she smiled and said she had enjoyed his as well, and he rode back to the ranch with that smile sitting in the center of his chest like a small, warm fire. Through November they walked together on Sunday afternoons and talked through Saturday mornings in the store, and the town of Dusthaven, which had been watching all of this with the collective attention that small towns bring to bear on anything romantic or scandalous, gradually shifted its opinion. Not uniformly, not without resistance, but perceptibly. It was helped considerably by the fact that Wesley had by November established himself so thoroughly as a reliable and honest man at the Harlow Ranch that Clifford Harlow himself had begun defending his character in the conversations that inevitably happened wherever men gathered in a small western town. "He works harder than any man I have hired in a decade," Harlow told anyone who raised the matter, "and he has not given me a single day's reason to doubt him." That carried weight. Clifford Harlow was not a man given to endorsing people lightly. Gerald Tupp remained a problem. Tupp had apparently decided that Wesley's presence in Fanny's life was a personal inconvenience, possibly because he had entertained his own ideas about Fannie Finley that he had never had the courage to make properly known but felt proprietorial about nonetheless. He began making comments, the kind of comments that are difficult to directly confront because they are wrapped in the appearance of casual concern. He told people he was only thinking of Fanny's welfare. He told people that a woman alone in business could not afford to be seen associating with a man of questionable reputation. He said these things in the saloon and at the feed store and over the counter of the telegraph office run by Fanny's brother-in-law, Floyd, who was a nervous, thin-necked man who repeated things Tupp said to his wife, who was Fanny's sister Clara, who brought them to Fanny. Fanny listened to what Clara reported and said, "Tell Floyd to stop repeating Tupp's opinions as though they were news." Clara, who was 3 years older than Fanny and had spent most of those 3 years worrying about her younger sister in various ways, said, "Fanny, you have to consider your reputation." "I consider my reputation every day," Fannie said, "rests on the quality of my merchandise and the fairness of my prices and the honesty of my dealings, and not on the company I choose to keep on Sunday afternoons. People are talking. People always talk. When have they stopped?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Do you care for him?" Fannie folded a bolt of calico with the careful, practiced movements of someone who has done it 10,000 times. "I believe I do," she said. "Yes." "Fannie," Clara's voice was not unkind, but it was worried. "He has a prison record. His brother is a criminal wanted in 3 territories." "His brother is not Wesley," Fannie said, "and the prison record is more complicated than it appears." "That is what he told you. I believe him." "You believed Patrick Greer," Clara said, and then flinched because she knew as soon as it was out of her mouth that it was a cruel comparison. Fannie set the bolt of calico down and turned to look at her sister. She did not say anything angry. She said, carefully and calmly, "Patrick Greer lied to me about facts. Wesley Rourke has told me nothing but the truth, including the truths that most men in his position would have hidden. They are not the same." Clara looked at her sister's face for a long moment and appeared to recognize something there that settled some internal argument. "All right," she said at last. "All right, Fannie." The day in late November that things shifted between Wesley and Fannie came without particular announcement. They were walking their usual creek path, but the weather had turned sharply cold, and the sky was the flat pewter color that meant serious winter was arriving. They had stopped on the bank where a big cottonwood had fallen years ago and made a convenient place to sit and watch the water. They were close together as people are when the cold makes proximity sensible, their shoulders touching. She had been telling him about a book she had been reading, a novel she had borrowed from the schoolteacher, and she was gesturing with one hand to illustrate a point, and in the middle of his response he reached out without quite planning to and took that gesturing hand in both of his and held it. She stopped speaking. The creek ran on. She looked down at their hands and then up at his face, and whatever she saw there made the worry in her expression dissolve into something else, something open and warm. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am not a man who says things he does not mean, so I want you to know I am very sure of what I am about to say." "Tell me," she said. "I have never in my life felt for anyone what I feel for you. And I am aware that sounds like something a man says when he is running a particular game, but I have no game to run. I just have the truth, which is that you are the finest person I have ever known, and the thought of you being part of my life going forward is the best thing I can think of." She looked at him for a long moment, and the wind moved through the bare cottonwood branches above them with a dry, whispering sound. "I have been very careful," she said, "since Patrick about opening things up again." "I know," he said. "I have been watching you," she said, "not with suspicion. But I have been paying attention to who you are when you think no one is watching. And you are exactly the same," she said. "The same man at the store counter and the same man walking back from the livery and the same man talking to Clem's daughter when she came by the ranch looking for her dog. You do not perform goodness, you just practice it." He exhaled slowly. "Fannie, I am not afraid of your record or your brother's name," she said. "I told you I was not counting strikes. I have been counting something else entirely, and by everything I have counted, you are the best man I have encountered in this territory." He leaned forward and kissed her then, gently, briefly, his free hand coming up to her jaw, and she kissed him back with a conviction that told him she had been thinking about this too and had been ready for it. They pulled back and looked at each other in the cold winter afternoon light, both of them with the slightly startled expression of people who have just confirmed something large and wonderful. "We should probably get you back before you freeze," he said. "Probably," she agreed, but neither of them moved for another several minutes. December brought the first real snow to the valley. It came down in the night, quiet and blanketing, and turned Dusthaven into a blue-white silence that the morning sun struck into gold. Wesley rode into town that Saturday morning, with the snow crunching under his horse's hooves and his breath making clouds in the cold air, and he came into the store where Fannie was lighting the stove. And she turned when he came in, and her face did the thing it had started doing when she saw him. a softening and brightening that he would not have traded for anything in the world. He helped her carry in firewood from the back. He helped her uncrate a new shipment of goods that had come in on the freight wagon the day before. These were not romantic activities by any conventional standard, but there was something in the ease of working alongside her, the comfortable rhythm of two people who simply enjoyed being in the same space, that felt more intimate than many things he had experienced that were supposed to be more significant. He told her about Dalton that December, the full story, not the abbreviated version he had told her in October. He told her about growing up with Dalton, who had been by turns charming and terrifying, a brother who could be generous to a fault and then turn around and use that generosity as a weapon, who had taught Wesley to ride and shoot, and then later taught him, by example, that the world was divided into those who took what they wanted and those who got taken from, a lesson Wesley had eventually, and with some difficulty, unlearned. He told her about their mother, a gentle Irish woman who had died of fever when Wesley was 14, and their father, who had been a decent man undone by grief and whiskey, and how the two brothers had been left largely to themselves to figure out what kind of men they were going to be. He told her that Dalton had made his choice early and irreversibly, and that Wesley had spent the first portion of his adult life being dragged in the current of it before he understood that the current was going somewhere he did not want to go. She listened to all of it. She had a quality of listening that was rare, not passive, not simply waiting for her turn to speak, but genuinely receiving what was said, turning it over, sitting with it. "Do you miss him?" she asked. "Dalton." He thought about it honestly. "I miss who he was when we were boys," he said, "before everything calcified, but the man he is now I do not miss. He frightens me, and I do not say that easily." "It is not easy to grieve someone who is still alive," she said. "No," he said. "It is not." She reached across the counter and took his hand briefly, firmly, and the gesture contained a kind of understanding that made his throat tight. He asked Clifford Harlow, in the week before Christmas, if he could have the holiday period off to be in town. Harlow, who had been watching the situation with Fannie Finley develop with the slow satisfaction of a man who believes in redemption when it is earned, said yes, and added without being asked that if Wesley was thinking of settling permanently in the valley, he should know that the position at the ranch was open to him on a long-term basis. "I was thinking of it," Wesley said. "Good," said Harlow, and went back to his ledger. Christmas in Dusthaven was celebrated with a church service, and a town gathering in the main street, with a bonfire against the cold and food contributed by every household, and the schoolchildren singing songs in voices that were more enthusiastic than accurate. Wesley stood with Fannie in the firelight, and for the first time since his arrival in Dusthaven, he was not the man being watched with suspicion, but simply a man standing with a woman he cared for among the people of a community, and the feeling of it was extraordinary. Not because everyone had accepted him entirely. Some of the older women still pinched their mouths when they looked at him, and Tup was visible across the bonfire looking sour, but because enough of the town had made their peace with his presence that he could stand without the constant feeling of being an intruder. He gave Fannie a present that Christmas. He had carved it himself in the evenings in the bunkhouse, a small wooden bluebird with jointed wings that could be spread or folded, because she had mentioned once in passing that she loved the way bluebirds appeared in New Mexico spring, and how they always seemed to her like proof that winter was not permanent. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked up at him with an expression that he found he could not quite look away from. "Wesley Rourke," she said, "you are a remarkable man." "You are a remarkable woman," he said, "and you are the one who decided to count differently." The new year, 1884, came in over the mesa with a sharp wind and a star-brilliant sky, and Wesley had made a resolution in the privacy of his own mind that the year would not be old before he asked Fannie Finley to be his wife. He sat with this resolution for several weeks, not because he was uncertain about wanting to ask, but because he wanted to be sure his situation was solid enough that the asking was not simply hopeful but genuinely practical. A man who wants to ask a woman to share his life should have something to offer her beyond his feelings, however genuine those feelings are. He needed to know that the Harlow position was secure, that his savings were sufficient to give them a start, and that the legal and reputational complications of his past were not about to fall on her. It was the last concern that materialized first and badly. In February of 1884, Dalton Rourke rode into Dusthaven. Wesley was in the barn at the ranch when Clem came and told him there was a man at the gate asking for him. From the description, he knew immediately. He walked out to the gate with the particular feeling of a man who has been bracing against a possibility for so long that, when it finally arrives, he is surprised to find it is simply happening, ordinary in its dreadfulness. Dalton looked worse than he had 3 years ago. He had a new hardness to his face and new shadows under his eyes that spoke of too much drinking and too much running and too little sleep. He sat his horse with the same careless confidence he had always had, but it had gone from charisma to something more like bravado, a performance for an audience that no longer existed. "Wesley," he said, with the easy familiarity of someone who did not acknowledge that there might be reasons for coolness. "Dalton," Wesley said. He did not open the gate. "What do you want?" "To see my brother." "You could have written." Dalton grinned. It was a familiar grin, warm-seeming and practiced. "You know I am not much for letters. I need a place to stay a couple of days, Wesley, just 2 days. I am not asking for anything else." "What are you running from?" "Misunderstanding in Lincoln County that I expect will sort itself out." "A misunderstanding in Lincoln County," Wesley repeated flatly. "It is more complicated than it looks." Wesley looked at his brother across the gate for a long moment. He thought about the payroll in Colorado. He thought about 2 years in Santa Fe. He thought about Fannie, about the morning light in the store and her voice saying something else entirely, about the bluebird he had carved and the way she had held it in both hands. "You cannot stay here," Wesley said. "This is not my property to offer you, and even if it were, my answer would be the same." Dalton's grin faded by degrees into something harder. "You are going to turn me away?" "Yes, your own brother. You left me holding a gun at a robbery you had organized and disappeared before the law arrived," Wesley said, his voice even. "I served 2 years for what you did. I'm not angry about it anymore because anger at you is not useful, but I am also not going to let you walk your trouble back into my life." Dalton looked at him for a long, calculating moment. "I heard you have gotten yourself comfortable here," he said. "Heard there is a woman." Wesley's hands were very still at his sides. "Ride on, Dalton." "I am just saying it would be a shame if Dalton." His voice was quiet and very clear. "If you come anywhere near Fannie Finley or near this ranch or near this town with anything except the intention of leaving it, I will go directly to the sheriff and give him everything I know about your whereabouts and activities in the past 3 years. And I know enough to be useful." He held his brother's gaze. "Ride on." There was a long silence. Then Dalton, with a short, almost amused exhale, turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, and Wesley stood at the gate and watched him go until he was small in the distance and then gone entirely. He rode into town that evening, directly to the store, because he needed Fannie to hear it from him before she heard it from anyone else. She was closing up when he arrived, turning the sign in the window and pulling the shutters against the cold evening air. She saw his face when he came in and said, immediately, "What happened?" He told her about Dalton's visit, all of it including the threat or the near threat about her. He watched her face while he told it, and she did not look frightened. She looked, if anything, quietly furious, not at Wesley but at the situation, at Dalton's assumption that he could use her as leverage. "Do you think he will leave?" she asked. "I think so. Dalton is many things, but he is not stupid, and he knows I meant what I said about the sheriff." She was quiet for a moment, her hands busy with the practical work of closing the store, and then she said, "I want you to know that this changes nothing for me. Fannie, Wesley, your brother's arrival does not change what I know about you." And if you are worried about what it might cost me in terms of reputation or comfort, I want to tell you right now that you can set that worry down, because I made my own calculation about you a long time ago, and Dalton Rourke appearing at a gate is not enough to overturn it. He stood there in the lamplight of the general store with all his careful words and plans momentarily insufficient to the moment. And then he crossed the distance between them in a few steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her with a wholeness of feeling that he had been holding back for months. And she kissed him back with the same. And they stayed that way until the cold draft from the shutters reminded them of where and when they were. She pulled back just slightly and looked up at him, her hands holding onto the front of his jacket, and said softly, "I was thinking, if you were going to stay in this valley, which I have gathered you intend to, then perhaps we should think about whether you would like to stay in it more permanently." "I was going to ask you that," he said. "You were taking a considerable amount of time about it," she said, and this time her smile was the full, radiant version with nothing held back, and it struck him once again exactly as it had the first time, like light breaking through cloud. "Fannie Finley," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation or performance. "I will." Sheriff Holt Grady, who was indeed the fair-minded lawman Wesley had been told about, received news of Dalton Rourke's presence in the territory with professional interest and dispatched a telegram to his counterparts in Lincoln County. Dalton was picked up 2 weeks later by a Lincoln County deputy in the town of Socorro and transported to face the charges there. Wesley received the news in a letter from Grady, who added that the testimony Wesley had offered regarding his brother's known associates and movements in Colorado had been useful in building the case. He read the letter twice, and then he set it down, and he felt the last weight of Dalton's shadow lift off his shoulders in a way that was so complete it felt physical. He told Fannie at the store the next morning. She read the letter herself and folded it carefully and handed it back to him. "It is done, then," she said. "It is done," he said. They were married in April of 1884 in the Dusthaven church with the tilting steeple, which the congregation had recently repaired so it no longer tilted. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Aldous Peake, who was a short, energetic man with spectacular mutton-chop whiskers and a genuine belief in the institution he was presiding over. The whole town came, or nearly all of it, because a wedding in Dusthaven was an event, and because most of Dusthaven had by now arrived at the opinion that Wesley Rourke was a man who had earned his place among them, and that Fannie Finley had chosen well. Even Clara, who had been cautious through the winter and had gone through several more conversations with her sister in which her worry had gradually been worn down by Fanny's steady certainty, stood in the front pew beside Floyd and wept with what appeared to be genuine happiness. Gerald Tupp did not come to the wedding. No one particularly noticed. Fanny wore a dress of ivory wool trimmed with cream ribbon, which she had made herself in the evenings in the back room of the store over the preceding months, and she had allowed Clara to do her hair, which was swept up with small sprays of the early spring wildflowers that had appeared along the creek that week. Wesley wore his best shirt and a jacket that Clifford Harlow had silently provided as a wedding gift without being asked, which fit him reasonably well, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Fanny walk toward him down the aisle, and felt something in his chest that had been tensed against the world for 15 years simply and completely release. They said their vows with the kind of careful attention that people give words when they mean every syllable of them. And when Reverend Peake said Wesley could kiss his bride, he did, and the assembled congregation of Dusthaven expressed their approval in a way that probably startled the livestock at the far end of town. The celebration afterward was held in the main street, where someone produced a fiddle and someone else produced a banjo, and the evening was warm enough for dancing. The good spring warmth of a New Mexico April that holds the promise of summer without the brutality of it. Wesley danced with Fanny, which he did with more enthusiasm than skill, and she laughed and guided him through it with her hand steady in his and her eyes bright, and it was the most purely happy he had been in his adult life. They made their home together in the small house that stood behind the general store, which Fannie had been living in for 2 years, and which they spent the early weeks of their marriage filling with the evidence of a shared life. Wesley built a new set of shelves for her books. She made curtains for the windows from a remnant of good fabric she had been keeping. He brought a rocking chair from the ranch that Clem had carved and given them as a wedding gift. Small accumulations, each one meaning more than its material value. He continued working at the Harlow Ranch through the week and came into town on Saturdays and Sundays. They were easy together in a way that neither of them had experienced before, a comfort that was not complacency but genuine belonging. They talked in the evenings about books she was reading and about the horses at the ranch and about what was happening in the wider world, because Fannie subscribed to a newspaper from Albuquerque and read it thoroughly and had opinions about what she read. He liked listening to her opinions. She was precise in her thinking and had a way of cutting through the decorative reasoning that people often put around their actual positions to find what was essentially being said. She ran the store through the summer with the same competence she always had, and he watched with quiet pride the way she handled everything that came at her, the difficult customers, the late freight, the accounting that kept the books balanced by margins that required skill, the credit extended to those who needed it. She was good at her work. She was excellent at it, actually, and he told her so, and she received the compliment with neither false modesty nor excessive pride, just a simple acknowledgement that she had worked hard to be good at it and was glad it showed. By the fall of 1884, Fannie was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday morning in September when the air had the first crisp edge of autumn in it, and the store was quiet, and she looked at him with a kind of wondering seriousness that he held in his memory for the rest of his life. He sat down in the chair by the stove rather abruptly, because the news hit him in a way he had not anticipated, not badly, but overwhelmingly well, the way a wave hits a man who has been standing steady and takes him off his feet not with violence but with sheer presence. "Are you all right?" she asked, watching him with that careful attention she brought to everything. "I'm the best I have ever been in my life," he said, and it was so plainly true that she crossed the room and sat beside him and took his hand. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Terribly, are you?" "Yes," she said, "but in the good way, I think, the way where the fear is made of how much it matters." "That is exactly the way," he said. He held her hand and they sat with the September morning coming through the windows and the town of Dusthaven going about its Saturday business around them. And the life they had built together held that particular quality of completeness that only comes when something has been honestly earned. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was hard in the valley, the kind of hard that the old-timers would later mark as one of the difficult ones, with snowfall that came heavy and stayed, cutting the ranches off from town for stretches of days and making everything slower and colder and more demanding. Wesley, with Harlow's permission, moved into town for the duration of the worst months to be with Fannie, who was heavily pregnant by January, and who bore the indignities of the winter with the same practical steadiness she brought to everything, though he noticed that she was more tired than she would admit and less comfortable than she pretended. And he made it his personal business to ensure that the firewood was always plentiful and the stove always burning, and that she had what she needed before he considered whether he had what he needed. Their son was born on the 9th of February, 1885, in the middle of a snowstorm so thorough that it turned the world outside the windows white and absolute. The birth was attended by the town's midwife, a competent and calm woman named Mrs. Abra Tilden, who had been delivering Dusthaven's children for 20 years, and by Clara, who held Fannie's hand through the hard parts and proved in those hours that, whatever her reservations had once been, she was entirely and completely on the side of her sister's happiness. Wesley waited in the front room of the store with the sound of the wind and the fire and his own heartbeat, and when Mrs. Tilden opened the door and said, "A boy, Mr. Rourke, and both of them healthy," he covered his face with his hands for a moment because the relief and the joy of it together were larger than he had room for. They named him James Thomas Rourke. James for Fanny's father, Thomas for no particular family reason except that they both liked the sound of it, and it suited the small, serious-faced boy who arrived in the world with dark hair, and they gradually determined over the following weeks, eyes that were going to be the color of warm honey. Clifford Harlow came to see the baby in March, when the snow had broken enough for travel, and stood in the back room of the store holding James with the concentrated care of a man who is aware that he is handling something of great importance, and looked down at the small face with an expression that Wesley recognized as the same one Harlow got when he was looking at a fine horse, deep appreciation mixed with something almost like awe. "Good work," Harlow said, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. Spring came again to the valley, the bluebirds appearing along the creek exactly as Fanny had described to Wesley a year and a half ago, and Wesley watched her walk with the baby along the creek path one afternoon in April and thought about the morning. He had ridden into Dusthaven with 3 strikes against him and every door effectively closed, and about the woman who had looked at him across a store counter and decided to count something else entirely. He had not changed what was true about his past by coming to Dusthaven. The prison record still existed. His brother's crimes still existed. His scarred face and his difficult history still existed. But Fanny had looked at those things and seen them for what they were, facts, not definitions, the weather of his past rather than the weather of his character, and she had instead counted the things that she believed said more about who he actually was. The patience he showed with animals and people, the consistency of his honesty, the steadiness of his work, the quality of his attention when she was speaking, the way he had wept, quietly and without shame, when their son was born. Those were the things she had been counting. In the summer of 1885, Gerald Tupp left Dusthaven. He had apparently decided that prospects were better in Arizona, a decision that the town of Dusthaven received without significant sorrow. His departure meant that the North End lot, which he had owned, came up for sale, and Fanny and Wesley, who had been quietly saving and planning, bought it. Not to expand the store, which Fanny kept at its existing scale because she had found the scale that she could manage excellently and had no desire to manage something larger less well, but to build a proper house. The house behind the store was comfortable but small for a family, and they had begun, in the easy conversation of a couple who have grown comfortable planning the future together, to suspect that James might eventually have company. Wesley built most of the house himself over the fall of 1885, with help from Clem and Denny and Esteban on the weekends, and with the occasional appearance of Clifford Harlow, who was apparently not above manual labor when the project interested him. It was a good house, solidly made, with a front porch that faced east to catch the morning sun, and windows that Fanny had specified for maximum light, because she intended to have her bookshelves in the front room where she could read in the afternoons. They moved into it before the first snow of 1885, and Fanny stood in the front room with James on her hip and looked at the shelves Wesley had built, which held her books, and at the light coming through the east windows, and turned to him with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that he felt the particular ache that comes when something is so good you can barely contain it. "It is exactly right," she said. "You are exactly right," he said. She rolled her eyes at him, but she was smiling. He had been doing well enough at the Harlow Ranch through 1884 and 1885 that Harlow had raised his wage twice and begun involving him in the decisions about which horses to breed and which to sell, which was the kind of inclusion that meant real trust. But a conversation in late 1885 between Wesley and Harlow, which began as a practical discussion about the spring breeding schedule, turned into something larger. Harlow said, without preamble, as was his habit, "I am thinking about what happens to this ranch when I am too old to manage it properly." Wesley looked at him steadily. "You are 52. 53 in December. I have no children. My wife has been gone 6 years." He paused. "I have been thinking about a partnership arrangement, not charity, real partnership. You would buy in over time against your wage and a portion of the profits." Wesley was quiet for a moment. "Clifford," he said carefully. "I am not sentimental about it," Harlow said. "You are the best man for this ranch, and I do not want to see it broken up and sold to strangers when I am done. That is the practical consideration. The rest of it, that I consider you a man worth investing in, that is simply also true." Wesley went home that evening and told Fannie about the conversation, and she listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and then said, "You should say yes. It is a large thing to take on. You are built for large things," she said simply. "You always have been. You just spent a long time being prevented from showing it." He accepted Harlow's offer. The formal arrangement was drawn up by the attorney in Dusthaven, a careful man named Morris Ashton, who prepared the documents with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this kind of agreement needed to be watertight against future complications. And Wesley signed them with Fannie beside him, and felt once again that particular sensation of the world becoming solid beneath his feet. The partnership changed things in ways he had not fully anticipated. He was, by the community's understanding, no longer simply a hired hand with a complicated past, but a man with a stake in the land, a co-owner of a significant ranching operation, a figure of genuine standing in the valley's economy. The town's relationship with him shifted accordingly, and while he did not particularly seek status for its own sake, he found that the stability it represented allowed him to breathe more freely, to move through Dusthaven without the constant background awareness of being watched and weighed. He realized one morning in the spring of 1886, standing on the porch of the house he had built and watching the valley come alive with the season, genuinely content. Not smugly or blindly, he knew the world was complicated and that contentment required maintenance, and that the injustices he and Fannie had talked about through countless evenings were real and ongoing, and not solved by his own good fortune. He knew that the Apache families displaced from this very valley had not been restored to it, and that the Mexican landowners whose grants had been seized were not compensated, and that the machinery of unfairness ground on in all the places he could not reach. He did not make peace with those things or decide they were not his business, but he was alive to the good that was immediately around him, and that was its own kind of practice. Fannie was expecting their second child in the summer of 1886. She told him in April, and he received it with the settled happiness of a man who has learned that good news does not need to be treated with suspicion. "Another boy," he wondered aloud. "I have no particular information on that point," she said dryly. Their second child, born in July 1886 during a warm summer night when the stars were brilliant over the mesa, was a girl. They named her Ruth Eleanor Rourke, Eleanor for Wesley's mother, and she arrived in the world with auburn hair exactly like her mother's, and a voice that she exercised with conviction and frequency, which Fannie said was simply a sign of good character. James, who was 17 months old when Ruth arrived, regarded his sister with the solemn attention of a small person confronting an important new fact about his world, and then, apparently satisfied with his assessment, put his hand very gently on her head in a gesture that no one had taught him and which made Clara, who was present, burst into fresh tears. "Floyd," she said later to her husband, "I want you to know that Fannie chose better than anyone in this family gave her credit for." Floyd, who was not a complicated man, said, "Yes, dear," and meant it. By the fall of 1886, the Rourke household had the quality of a place that has been loved into its best shape. The front room with its books and its morning light. The kitchen where Fannie made excellent biscuits on Sunday mornings. The children's room that had been the spare room until James needed it, and now held a small bed and a cradle side by side. The back garden where Fannie had planted vegetables and Wesley had built a fence to keep out the deer, and the fence had kept out exactly 0 deer, but they had agreed it looked nice. The porch where they sat in the evenings when the children were asleep and the day had given way to the cool, star-thick western night. They talked on that porch, the way they had been talking since those early Saturdays in the store, about everything. About the book she was reading and the horse that was causing trouble at the ranch, and what James had said that morning that had been unexpectedly funny, and whether Ruth's hair was going to curl or stay straight, and what they thought about the political situation in the territory and what they hoped for the coming year. The conversation had never stopped between them. It had only deepened and expanded, the way a creek does when the spring comes and fills it properly. He had never been a man who talked easily before Fannie. He had learned to be quiet as a defense mechanism, to give away nothing, because giving away things about yourself made you vulnerable, and vulnerability in the life he had lived was expensive. With her, he had unlearned that particular caution, not recklessly but thoroughly. He talked to her the way he thought, without performance, and she received him as he was, which was still the most remarkable thing that had ever happened to him. One evening in late October 1886, they were sitting on the porch in the cooling air, both of them with coffee, the children asleep inside. The mesa to the west was going dark, the last light of the sunset lifting off the top of it in bands of copper and rose, and the valley was settling into the deep quiet of a western evening. "I was thinking today," Fannie said, "about the first morning you came into the store. You did not look up for quite a while," he said. "You were reading a letter." She glanced at him. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about that morning." She was quiet for a moment, watching the last light on the mesa. "I was reading a letter from my father. He was not well and the letter was worrying. I was trying to decide whether to go to Tucson." She paused. "And then you came in and I looked up and I thought, that is an interesting man." "Interesting," he repeated with a small lift of amusement. "You looked like someone who had been through a great deal and had not been broken by it," she said. "That was what I thought, and I thought that is not a bad quality in a person." She turned to look at him fully. "I was right." He looked at her in the soft October dusk, this woman who had looked at 3 strikes and counted something else, who had stood steady when Dalton's shadow crossed the valley, who had built a business with her own hands and run it with excellence, and let the community she served become her community in return, who had held their son and then their daughter with the same capable, wholehearted love she brought to everything, who had made a home with him that was the best place he had ever known. "Fannie," he said. "Wesley," she said, with a small, perfect smile that was identical to the one she had given him across the store counter the day she first said she was counting something else entirely, and in it he recognized the whole of the life they had built, the trust and the honesty and the work and the pleasure and the children and the porch and the morning light and the years stretched out ahead of them, full and open and earned. He reached over and took her hand. She interlaced her fingers with his. They sat on the porch of the house they had built in the town that had become theirs, in the wide, Red Mesa Valley of New Mexico territory, in the good company of each other, and watched the stars come out one by one over the darkening west. 3 strikes. It turned out they had not been the measure of him after all. Fannie Finley had known that from a morning in early spring when she had looked up from a letter and seen a man who looked like someone the world had tried to break, and had decided, with the precise and generous clarity that was her particular gift, to count something else entirely. She had been right. And the counting had brought them here, to this porch, to this life, to this evening, which was the truest and best thing either of them had ever found. James Thomas Rourke grew into a serious, kind boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's patience, and Ruth Alina Rourke grew into a bright and opinionated girl who had her mother's directness and her father's steadiness, and they grew up knowing that they were loved not only by their parents, but by a community that had watched their family take root in the valley and had been part of it, after their own complicated fashion. The Harlow Ranch became, over time, what Wesley had always believed it could be. Clifford Harlow aged gracefully, and with the satisfaction of a man who had made good arrangements, and when he passed in 1891, The ranch passed into full partnership terms that he had established, with a portion going to a nephew in Missouri and the larger portion to Wesley, because Harlow had added a codicil to his will that reflected what he had told Wesley directly, that the ranch needed a man who understood its value, and he had found that man. Fannie ran the store into the 1890s, and it became one of the most reliable establishments in the region, known for honest pricing and quality stock, and for the proprietor's willingness to extend credit to those who needed it and her absolute refusal to be intimidated by those who did not. She sat on the town council from 1889, one of the first women to do so in that part of the territory, a development that she accepted with characteristic practicality, noting that someone needed to represent the interests of the business community, and since no one else was doing it efficiently, she might as well. Wesley was, by that point, a man of genuine standing in the Dusthaven community. The prison record and the brother's name had not vanished from the territory's memory, but they had been thoroughly overlaid by the reality of who he had become in the valley, the honest rancher, the fair employer, the man who had helped several young men get their starts in the business when they had nowhere else to turn, paying forward the chance he had been given. He had not forgotten what it felt like to be turned away, and he made it a point never to turn away someone who was genuinely trying. He never heard from Dalton again after the arrest in Socorro. Dalton was tried and convicted and served a long sentence, and whatever happened to him after that, Wesley did not seek out the information. He had made his peace with that particular grief, the loss of the brother Dalton might have been, and he carried it quietly and did not let it define the shape of the good life he was living. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, April 1894, Wesley and Fannie sat again on the porch, as they had sat on countless evenings, with the children inside and the valley going quiet around them. James was 9 and Ruth was 7, and both of them were asleep in the room they had long since ceased sharing with adequate grace, but managed nonetheless. The cottonwoods along the creek were in their spring yellow-green, and the air had the particular sweetness of a New Mexico April evening. Fannie was reading, as she often was in these porch hours, a new book arrived from a bookseller in Santa Fe that she had been anticipating for weeks. Wesley was watching the distant mesa, as he often did, with the comfortable absence of thought that came from being entirely at peace with where and who he was. She looked up from the book after a while and found him watching the mesa and watched him instead, the way she still did sometimes, the same way she had watched him in the early days of their acquaintance, with close attention and genuine interest. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned his head and looked at her. "I was thinking," he said, "about the morning I rode into Dusthaven, about what I thought the place might or might not offer." "And what did you think?" "I thought I might find work," he said. "I thought, if I was lucky, I might find a place where people would eventually stop looking at me like I was already guilty of whatever they had not thought of yet." He paused. "I did not think to hope for anything like what I actually found." Fannie closed her book and held it in her lap and looked at him in the spring evening light. "What did you find?" she asked softly, not because she needed to hear it, but because she understood that sometimes the speaking of a thing was its own kind of gift. "Everything," he said simply. "I found everything." She reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand, the familiar weight of it in hers. 10 years of evenings on this porch and the life inside the house and the town around them and the valley beyond, all of it held in the uncomplicated gesture. "I was right," she said, "to count something else entirely." "You were right about everything," he said. She smiled, the full, warm, unreserved smile that had been pulling him toward the light since the first time he had seen it across a store counter in the spring of 1883, when he had been a man with nothing but 3 strikes against him, and she had looked at him and quietly, decisively, begun to count differently. The stars appeared over the mesa. The creek murmured south of the house. The children slept. The valley settled into its vast and beautiful western dark. And Fannie and Wesley Rourke sat on their porch in the easy warmth of a love that had been built carefully and honestly from a beginning, that most people would have said was no beginning at all, and which had become, against every prediction and in spite of every strike, the whole and irreplaceable center of both their lives.